Hello everyone and welcome back. Today in this video I want to talk about 10 common mistakes that I see in Commander very frequently for old and new players and ways we can fix them. So here's a disclaimer, right? This list isn't going to be for everyone. You're going to have different play groups, you're going to have different level of deck intensities like, oh, my deck's a 7, haha, whatever. And just the specific decks that you're going to be using are maybe different from what I'm saying, and I'll try to call them out as I go. Every playgroup's going to be different. Do what makes sense for your playgroup, right? If you guys have good rule zeros that you guys all agree upon, great, cool, ignore my video, do what makes sense for you. This list isn't definite. I'm going to be wrong about a lot of these things, but they're just my opinions on how to improve really decks in a broad and general sense. It's not going to be true for every deck, but for the majority of decks, they're all general and broad. This will improve the deck. And this video is aimed towards new players that have difficulty building decks, because I know everyone that starts deck building, it can be definitely a challenge. But this video is also for more veteran players who just kind of need to look back at the basics. Sometimes, even I do the same thing. We get so enfranchised in what we know, we just kind of forget the simple parts of it. Channel and deck stuff, get the card you need from the link down below, yada yada yada. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and for this video especially comment down below what you think of the points I make. I want to hear your comments on it. I want to talk to you guys in the comments about what you think about what I said down below, and we'll have a chat. So the first quote-unquote mistake I want to add is playing too few lands. I see a lot of people, they'll be like, oh yeah, 33 lands, like 32 lands is good enough because I got a ton of rocks. And I'm going to tell you, it's not going to be that good. Your early game is going to be so inconsistent and slow when you don't have enough lands. Like if you rely on rocks, you're going to find yourself in really awkward points because you'll keep like, you don't want to find yourself just having 2 lands, right? You don't want to find yourself 2 lands and begging for a third because you're like, oh, well, I have 2 lands and like a talisman or a signet. And it's like, okay, well, like you're not going to really make it there. It can be really awkward because it's going to drastically slow you down. Like like missing 1 land drop early game, maybe not detrimental, but definitely will slow you down a lot. The way you can really fix it is obviously just running more lands. I like to keep a minimum of 35 lands, and I'm not talking like, 30 lands and 5 MDFCs. I'm talking like 30 honest to God lands, like basics, duels, whatever. That's like the easiest way, just add more cards to the deck, obviously. But I think other ways you can do it are by running a little bit of fetch lands, right? You can go really easy and just run Evolving Wilds to just kind of thin your deck just a little bit, search the color you need, and that will help you out a lot. Or you could go the more advanced route, pay a bit more cash, and pay like fetch lands like Marsh Flats to search up your duels or your shock lands or whatever, your triumphs, get whatever. Really just having these kinds of cards are going to keep you more consistent on colors. And you can kind of do them at a really good budget. Not running enough card draw will also be very detrimental. You can run out of gas and your opponents are going to continue their board. It's really not going to feel good. Let me give an example. You guys ever play limited, like a pre-release or a draft event? And as you go on, you run like the 16 lands they recommend, whatever, in the little pre-release kits. And you're like, okay, cool. And then eventually you play all the cards you have and you're like, oh, I'm literally on the draw. This happens in a lot of limited games, and you don't want to be top decking, right? You're going to run out of gas. Your opponents are going to continually draw their cards. Like, if you only have a few card draw spells in your deck, this is going to happen. And I'm not talking cards like cantrips where it's like, oh, I'll scry 1 and draw a card, like a quick little opt. Like, I'm not kind of talking about that card draw. I'm talking like, you want to have repeatable card draw. Like if you're a creature heavy deck, I picked Guardian Project as a really good example, just so whenever you play a creature, you're going to draw a card. Or even cards like Phyrexian Arena, where it's at the beginning of your turn, you draw an extra card at like the detriment of a life. Like these cards are going to be, not very exciting the turn they come down, but they're value engines and they're really going to be like help you out later. Overcommitting to the board can also be very sketchy. It can win you the game, but it can also set you back. And I know a lot of decks, like token decks, kind of need to do this, but you can also be smart about it. If an opponent has like an army of creatures, if they're just waiting for a nuke, like if I'm playing the game and I see that my opponent is playing like a token deck and they have like 15 plus creatures, like I'm going to wipe the board as soon as possible. Regardless, as much as a detriment is to me, like I'm going to lose the game if I don't wipe that board. They're going to play some kind of overrun effect. and I'm gonna die, right? That's just what's gonna happen. So you don't want to overcommit to board. You want to make sure that you always have a contingency plan to see if things go wrong, right? What I'm trying to say is you don't want to just dump your hand just because you can, right? Like, you're not going to win with like these flashy power moves. You're going to win with consistency. So if you just start flooding out and play like, okay, a bunch of creatures now, and then I'm going to swing out, like having one more creature card from your hand, like let's say for example you're playing like an elf deck, like a token elf deck, and you're like, okay, well I already got like 15 dudes on the field and I got a bunch of open mana, I might as well play like Oracle of Moldiah, or I might as well play like this other value creature for like next turn. It's like, well, you're probably in a position where there might not be really a next turn, and if someone wipes the board, not only do you lose everything that you had, but you also just lost everything that's in your hand. Kind of the ways you can work around this are kind of both ways, right? Wrath of God is just going to destroy you, right? This is the kind of card I have in mind. It's the most simple nuke in Magic, just destroy all creatures, they can't be regenerated. That can that's going to ruin our day. We can run cards like Heroic Intervention if we do need to overcommit to board. That's so that way if someone does wipe the board, at least we can kind of keep our stuff around a little bit, so it's kind of a one-off like psych out. But really the only way we can really fix this is if we're already in a really good winning spot, don't go nuts, don't go overboard, play consistent, play steady. Steady progress is going to be better than one big flashy move. Like, it's better to have a consistent board state build up over time and do incremental damage throughout rather than have one big turn and like one big swing. Now that's not always true because you can have cards like Craterhoof or Overrun where you have to, but for the majority of decks, right, don't go too nuts. You don't want the crackback to kill you. On the exact opposite end, running too few interaction can also be pretty bad in Magic. A bunch of having too little interaction and just removal will really just make one player steamroll over the others. And if you don't have the removal, you're ultimately just going to have to deal with whatever your opponents are up to, right? If your opponents just have these big value engines, or your opponents are just yeah, I played this artifact that and you don't have that artifact removal, it's great. Or let's say an easy example, Mirari's Wake, a mana doubler and a lord for your field, right? It's a problematic card. You got to get rid of that. Your opponent has double mana and other creatures are a little bit bigger, right? If we don't have removal for it, oh well, we just have to watch this happen. It's so the way we can really do this is run at least 6 pieces of interaction. When I'm talking interaction, I'm talking spot removal. Anguish Making is a great example because it hits most things. I'm talking counter spells, for example, counter spell, and I'm talking nukes. Nukes are just destroy all creatures or destroy a bunch of permanents all at once. Really, anything that destroys multiple permanents at once, in my book, is a nuke. Farewell is a really good example of that because you get to do basically everything, or whatever makes the most sense. If you're an artifact deck, don't say artifacts, but get rid of all creatures, enchantments, and graveyards. We just want to make sure that as we're playing the game, one opponent just isn't going too crazy, right? If they have an explosive deck, we need to be able to stop them or at least halt them so that we just don't die in a few turns. We want to make sure that everything's kind of a nice level playing field. Another mistake I see is not mulliganing aggressively enough. If your hand is good, that's fantastic, great, but a really bad opener will set the tone for the rest of the game. And I'm talking cards let's say, for example, your opening hand is a Portal to Phyrexia. You're wow, I'm not gonna, it's turn 0 right now. I have a 9 CMC card in my hand. Am I realistically going to cast this anytime soon? The answer is probably not, right? Or at least if you're in a high CMC deck or other things, obviously there's exceptions to everything. If you're trying to discard and cheat things into play, that's different, right? But I'm talking for usual decks. Let's just say, for example, you're playing I don't know, Pirate Tribal. Why not, right? And you have a big 9 mana card in your hand. You probably don't want that. It's probably makes more sense to... And if it's one card, it's no big deal. But I'm talking oh, you have a 6 CMC card, a 7 and a 9, and you a couple lands. You want to make sure you have interaction. Keeping a 2-land hand is also not that good. You want to make sure that your hand's not just okay, right? I see a lot of people say that. How's your hand? Oh, my hand's okay, right? It's not good, it's not bad. Usually an okay hand is you got enough lands, but you don't have enough things to do with those lands right now. So I'm talking mulligan. Don't be afraid. I'll say, at least in my play group, and usually most commander play groups, you usually will get a free mulligan, and that's okay. And even if that doesn't work, going down to 6 can be absolutely game changing. Like filtering out your hand and making sure that you're getting like a legitimate good start rather than just settling for whatever you can be good. Also, don't keep 2-land hands. They're risky. Again, decks are decks are decks. If it makes sense for the deck, go for it. But generally, don't do it. So really the solution is knowing what your deck needs and making sure that you can engage with that plan as soon as possible, right? Keeping a portal to Phyrexia makes sense if I'm like, oh, I want to discard it and reanimate it in like a Duretti deck or like artifact reanimation deck or whatever, right? That makes sense. But generally you're like, oh, I gotta find a Soul Ring. Like almost keeping a turn 1 Soul Ring is one of the best things you can do. Oh yeah, the lose rate's higher for turn 1 Soul Ring. Shut up, nerd. Doesn't matter, right? Do what makes sense. Ramp is good early game. That's what you want. Not playing politics is something I see a lot of people do. And personally, I love playing politics. Commander is a lot like poker, right? It's not a traditional 1-to-1, like modern, limited, like standard. Like there's no deals you're going to make with your opponent in 1-to-1, right? But Commander's like poker, right? You're playing your opponents. You want to make sure that you're making allegiances and doing all these kinds of things, like avoiding damage. Even like the classic, how about this? Like, you're the monarch, right? How about like, if you let me hit you, I'll let you hit me back. Like, I won't block your creatures, but like, I just want the card draw, and like, that's like a good trade. Like, people will do that. Like, people making allegiances is really good. And at the very worst, you're like, come on, man. Like, you can, don't hit me. Hit someone else. Like, that's usually enough. You don't want to avoid persuasion and making deals. That can actually make you the target. It's always better that your opponents are losing out than you. And what I mean by that is just like, hey man, don't attack me, attack player B. And like the solution for this is talking to people, right? Explain why attacking player B is better and convince him why why it would be bad to attack you and why it would be beneficial to attack player B. I know politics can be annoying or whatever. That happens every once in a while. But ultimately, at the end of the day, simple conversation like that can be the difference of being like, come on, man, don't blow up my Soul Ring, or come on, man, like attack that guy, not attack me. Either way, you're saving yourself damage, you're saving yourself potential permanent loss, and things like that. Like, it's ultimately advancing your game state while doing literally nothing that involves magic. Politics is so incredibly important. And even cards like Council's Judgment, right? Where it's a voting thing where you're like, hey, listen, man, if you don't vote this thing, I'll vote along with you. Because clearly, if you're playing this card, you want to get rid of something for sure. And I'll vote along with this to make sure that, like, we don't all blow up everyone's things. Like, we can make a deal so that only one person loses out rather than all of us lose out. It's important politics. Life is a resource until it isn't. Life is a resource. That is 100% true. It can be used for win cons if you're a life gain deck. It can be used in many decks as a great way. You can play politics to be like, hey man, like you can crash in for like 3, like no big deal. If like you have like a combat trigger that makes sense for your creature, it's like, yeah, like if you do this, I'll take 3 damage and then like you have to do me a favor in the future. But late game, that can cost you the game. I'm talking greedy life payments and incremental life payments that will add up over time. Sylvan Library and Black Market Connections are really, really good examples of these. Sylvan Library is at the beginning of your draw step. You may draw 2 additional cards. If you do, choose 2 cards in your hand drawn this turn, and for each of those cards, pay 4 life or put them on top of your library. So what you can do with this card is ultimately every turn, pay 8 life to draw 2 extra cards. People do that. And that sounds really, really good, especially on a 2-mana thing. Like, you're ultimately looking at the top 3 and you're rearranging, but people very well will be like, yeah, I think I'll just lose 8. Like, 8's no joke. 8 is like a fifth of your life total. Like, that's no joke.